Brad Bischoff is a director, writer, editor. He has recently been named 25 New Faces in Independent Film by Filmmaker magazine. Brad's father-in-law, Roberto Olivera, he grew up as a migrant worker in the tomato fields of Southern California. Brad recently directed a movie, a short film entitled Field Song, based upon his father-in-law's experience in the fields. They both join me today to discuss the film, Roberto's story, and why Brad found the story so inspiring. Welcome, Brad. Welcome, Roberto. Let's watch a clip from Brad's film, Field Song.
Nací en Los Files, al norte de Tijuana, en una vecindad que se llamaba Otay. Ahora es un pueblo, pero en ese tiempo eran puros files de tomate. Mi mamá cruzó la frontera para trabajar en el tomate y yo nací allí. Mi padrastro era un toro, una mula. Trabajaba como oso. No tenía cariño ni amor. Odiarlo porque era tan cruel. Pero el hombre sabía trabajar. Él entendía que la vida era sufrir. Trabajaba 8 o 10 horas al día y luego en la noche en los empaques. Y yo le ayudaba. Es una lección que él me enseñó. Que el dolor, las cortadas, la pesada del fil, se puede sobrevivir y uno puede cumplir con lo que uno quiere.
Roberto, this is you talking?
Absolutely.
Okay, and Brad, you and Roberto's daughter, Maria, you're married, correct?
Yes.
So how long have you been married to Maria now?
5 years in.
About 5 years. And you have children with her?
2 kids, yeah, a 3.5-year-old daughter and a 1.5-year-old son.
So now, Roberto has a very unique story growing up. He's not, you wouldn't recognize him apparently, the type of story he had by meeting him today. How did you discover his story?
I didn't know anything about his past or growing up working the fields until my wife and I just moved to California with our children. And as a way to get on our feet, he offered for us to kind of stay with them for a little bit. And while we were there, I feel like I really got to know him as I saw him every day. And we actually lived right by the fields that he worked. So on a couple of car drives together, I think candidly, he had just told me, I used to work on those fields. And that's sort of how it all began.
And those fields still exist today. So how would you describe Roberto for people who don't know him?
I think he's a poet. He's an artist. He's a man of Shakespeare. And he's also just one of the hardest working people I know. From everything I've been told by my wife and him growing up before I knew him, he broke, almost broke his back working those fields and put himself through college. And then he's like a self-made man.
So you chose a very simple approach, just his voice in Spanish, empty fields. Tell me why you chose that.
I wanted to basically, because you don't see him until the end of the film. And I wanted to give the fields a face. So it's as if you're driving by the fields, which I do every day. I drive by them every day. And it's almost, you forget that it's not just a beautiful landscape. There's actually pain there. There's hardship there. There's survival there. And I wanted to show it as if you're just driving by, and then it's not until the end that you actually see the portrait of the man who worked them. So it was always about the reveal to me.
Mm-hmm. And when did you make this film?
2 years ago.
And when you were making this film, immigration is still in news today. It was big in the news 2 years ago. Did you make this film in reaction to immigration?
I wanted to basically humanize this idea of somebody, and I didn't approach it with a political message or intent. I wanted to basically honor a story that I heard from my father-in-law, and so we tell it through a poem, through a real story, and that's Roberto's story.
So, Roberto, when Brad approached you about doing the film, what did you think?
I was not happy about the idea. My wife and family were, you should do this. You need to tell this story. I had spent time with Bradley. I had shared these stories with him, and he said, well, I want to do it. And I finally agreed to it, but I was reticent at first because The stories of family and life, some of them are not that pretty. You wonder whether or not they should be told. But we got into one story in particular about my stepfather, the violence of some of those circumstances and how I took those lessons and what I made of them in my life were positive, and I took them that way. When Bradley told me we need to say this, then I agreed.
Would you be willing to share one of the incidents and a lesson that you learned from it?
One evening, my stepfather came home and his hands were completely bloodied. It was obvious that someone had either knifed him or pitchforked his hands. He was very drunk. He worked in the fields both in the day and in the evening, and he had gotten in some kind of an altercation, and his hands literally had holes through the fingers. And he came home and he was very excited and proud. And he sat at the table and he said, I beat the hell out of that son of a gun. And he took a bottle of tequila and he poured the alcohol on his hands and rubbed them together and said, I made it through it. And some people would have looked at it and said, wow, I mean, this guy is crazy. I looked at it and said, you know what, this guy can do anything. And if he can do anything, I can do anything. This guy could work like nobody I've ever met in my life. And I took that lesson along with my mother's lessons from this horse, from this bull, from this mule. If I just work like hell, I can do something with my life.
Where were you born?
I was born in San Diego. Most of my family was born in Tijuana. My mother was an American citizen, second generation. She lived in Los Angeles, and my father found her there and took her back to Mexico, and the whole family was born in Tijuana. But my mother would cross the border to work in the American fields. You would walk across in those days.
There was no border security. You just walked across.
You just walked across. I mean, it was an open border.
Right.
I mean, yeah, there was a checkpoint, but if you didn't want to go through the checkpoint, you just walked across.
Walk 100 yards down the street.
Field. We had friends that lived in the Otay Mesa, which is California, and she walked across there at 7.5 months pregnant. And she was working in the tomato fields there. There was celery and all that stuff, but at that time it was the tomato fields. She got sunstroke, and I was born in the United States. So as an American citizen, I was the first one.
What happened to your father?
My father still lived in Mexico. He's a raging alcoholic. My mother took me back, and we stayed another 5 years, and she had one more daughter in the United States the same way, my sister Raquel. When I was about 4.5, and my sister was 3, she decided that was enough, and she got on a train and brought all the kids and all of us to Ventura County, and that's where she met my stepfather, and we started working in the fields together.
There was cruelty on the behalf of your stepfather on you. Tell us about what it was like working in the fields, when you started working in the fields and what you were doing.
You know, when you're a kid and you're 5 years old, 6 years old, and you're working in the walnut orchards, it's an adventure. You know, that they use these giant hooks and you put them up and shake the tree and the walnuts fall. It's like raining golf balls coming down on you. And obviously in the tomato fields and the carrots and the onions, it became tedious. And by the time I was 13, 14 years old, I mean, they had children's crews, and that was the time of the Bracero program, which they brought Koreans and Filipinos and Japanese and Mexicans. It was just after World War II, so they had agricultural labor and huge. They had huge camps. By the time I was 13, I was shining shoes for migrant workers in all of those camps, but I was working in the fields during the day, and I enjoyed it, and my family did it together. In the summer months, we would all go there, all 5 of us. We would drag the boxes of tomato through the field and fill them up and then take them back and stack them, and I didn't know better. I mean, what could I say? The lesson was from my stepfather, work.
You've worked your entire life. Was there ever a time when you didn't work? Since you were 5?
Oh, no.
Never.
I've worked, and I taught people how to make $150,000, $250,000 a year. being salesmen. And those were the lessons that I learned as a field worker. I tried to teach that work ethic to my children without the cruelty, obviously. I have nothing but the proudest moments about my girls and my boy. And you know what? When you're a parent and you can say, my children came out to be good people, they respect, they care. I nurtured their education in a multicultural framework and a multi-religious framework. I tried to teach them that God's house has many rooms and there's room for everybody. And I'm very proud of them, all of them, including Mireya for marrying Bradley.
When you were growing up, tell us about where you lived.
I lived in a community called La Colonia. It was a World War II, post-World War II small housing project in Ventura County. By that time, if you'll pardon the expression, I don't mean it in any offensive way, most of the white Americans who were privileged and had lived there had moved out, and it had become a barrio. It had become a staging place for first generation and first arrival immigrants, all Mexican in that area, and some Filipino because of the field work. We had a 1-bedroom home, 1 bathroom, and there were 6 of us there, and there were often extended family there, and I slept on a small fold-up cot in the kitchen. Most of my life I slept on the floor. It wasn't a bad thing. In fact, when I married Deborah, there were times where I slept on the floor in our homes, and she was going, "Why are you doing that?" I said, "I just feel more comfortable on the floor. Come join me."
You started working in the fields at 5. You were able to go to school and work, I understand, 2 different jobs at the same time. How were you able to do all of that?
It was just something that was important. There was a dark side to it. Let me share it. I did not want to be around my stepfather. By the time I was in my early teens, the relationship had grown extremely violent. I didn't want to be home. So I worked in the fields during the day, or I went to school during the day, and then I worked in restaurants until midnight, and I'd come home at 1 o'clock in the morning, get up and do that. And strangely enough, those habits still follow me.
When was the last time you saw your stepfather?
Oh my God. I never saw my mother after I left for almost 6 years. I had to sneak into the house because it was a violent situation. If he didn't accost me, he accosted her for seeing me. I went to the hospital when he died. And I remember having a discussion with my sister when he was dying some 20 years ago, and I thought I should pay respects, and I said to my sister, "I'm trying to remember the good times," and she said, "There were never any good times." And he occasioned her suffering as a young woman, probably more than mine. Mine was just the violence of 2 men, but that's probably enough said there.
You ended up getting a scholarship to college. How did your parents react to that, and how did you get the scholarship?
It was a program in education during that time where they took disadvantaged youth and said, "Hey, this guy, this girl, they might have some merit. Let's put them in college and see if they can succeed." There was a gentleman named Mr. Appenzeller. I'll never forget him. I met him when I was a freshman in high school, and he just took a liking to me, and he called me into his office one day and said, "They have this program at the University of Santa Barbara, and if you apply, I think you can get into that university, and I think you can do that if you work hard." And that was pretty familiar to me. It resonated with me, from the cruelty of my stepfather to the philosophy of my mother. And sure enough, I got into the University of Santa Barbara. I went there. From there, I went to USC Law School, and I just grunted it out. What did John McCain say? He said, I had the distinction of graduating at the bottom of my class. And yes, I did. I graduated at the bottom of my class.
How did you feel leaving your parents? There was an issue about you leaving for college. Tell me about that.
It was terrible. My stepfather did not want me to leave because I was a wage earner. At 15, 16 years old, 17, I was already earning men's wages during the summer, so I was bringing home a full field worker's wage. I was working contract field, which meant they paid you by the boxes you picked, so all that money went to the family. He didn't want me to leave, and he said, no, no way, you're not going to college. One evening at 4 o'clock in the morning, it was my mother and I's custom. She said to me, I packed your suitcase. It's outside by the corner. You take that offer from that college and you go and you don't look back. Do you hear me? You don't look back. And so I left. She wasn't throwing me out of the house. She was telling me, make a life. If I get to see you again, it will be a good thing.
I thought this was really interesting, you know, what you say about what your mom taught you. She said, life is suffering. It was just about hard work and hard work in the fields, and life is all about suffering. Is that inspirational to you, or does that hurt you when you hear about life suffering?
It took me years to understand what she was saying. For some period of time, I thought she was just negative, but it wasn't that way at all. In fact, she was teaching me a lesson that whatever you want to do, you have to work for. Make your way a day at a time. When I got out of law school, I worked for Ventura County Council for a period of time as a clerk. I worked at a contract and family law firm, and then I got into the title insurance business. And I've been a title insurance salesperson and executive and CEO for probably 30 years.
You never did any more labor?
No, I haven't. I haven't gone back to the fields.
No.
But I drive by them every day, and
You see them.
I remember them.
How did you ultimately get to become a well-adjusted person, having grown up the way you did?
All of us have traumas. That was just our life. I did not want to wallow in the violence. I didn't want to wallow in that, although I have scars about what happened to my sister. But she has made her way. She's a Regent scholar and a doctorate in Spanish literature, and she's about to retire. She had many dark moments, but she made her way. I think part of it was my mother telling us, if you wallow in the things that have happened to you, you see no promise in the opportunity before you. This is a country where you can do that. You can come from suffering and means, and you can suffer here, and yet if you struggle, you can get there. And there's many that don't. There's sad stories, okay? I've lost two brothers to violence and drugs. I've lost a brother to alcohol. I had a brother burned alive in a fire and drugs. I mean, I've lost a sister to stomach ailments when we were just children because there was no medical care here in this country in 1953, 1956.
You ever think about why your mother had such great common sense to impart on her children, yet ended up staying with somebody that you're describing as a monster?
Oh, he beat the hell out of her.
She was scared.
I have visions of it. I have nightmares of it. I can see him striking her. I think she struggled to my first father's alcoholism in Mexico and tried to make a go of it, and it didn't work. And then she came here and she married this man. And I don't know today, and this is a sad thing. I mean, ask yourself, have I taken the time to know the life of my parents? With all that I've achieved, I don't really know if my mother was ever in love with that man. I just know that she did everything she could so that he could support us and take care of us. And if it was one chicken or a bologna and cheese sandwich, it was there on the table until I left. I think her lesson was always that life is suffering, but you can persevere.
Her success is looking at how you turned out, how your sister turned out, successful people, despite everything and the traumas and the heartache and the abuse. She successfully raised two successful children. Tell us if you've reached your American dream or what your American dream would look like if you haven't reached it.
I've lived it. I'm happy with the American dream, and I think it's still real. I think the cynicism and the political bantering that is going on and the social platforms that represent it otherwise, there's still people here. I see them every day. I interact with them. I'm probably going to go back and practice law in a small community, and there's people every day struggling to achieve this American dream, and they're happy here. They don't want to go back to Mexico. They don't want to go back to Korea. They don't want to go back to China. They think this is a place where they can be, but more importantly, they believe this is a place where their children can be better than them. Let me not be political. I mean, this is not the best country in the world. It's the only country in the world where you can achieve from meager places a dream of reality. You may not be president of the United States, you may not be a lawyer, but you will make a living and your children will grow and achieve. That is a rare opportunity in life for an immigrant.
Kind of like with the film, I feel like we're all so much more alike than you think, regardless of race or cultural background. Once you sit down and talk to somebody face to face and have a conversation, you realize that there's universal human truths that we all share. And my dream is currently being lived. I'm married to the most beautiful girl I've ever seen, and I have 2 kids with her, and we make films, and we travel around, and that in itself is work too. But I certainly enjoy it, and that's my dream.
Do you plan to do any more movies with Roberto in the future?
I would love to. Yeah, we got to do a feature. We got to do one.
Well, thank you both for coming on. The movie, the short film is called Field Song, written and directed by Brad Bischoff, about his father-in-law, Roberto Olivera's upbringing and ultimate success in life. Thank you both for coming on. I actually look forward to watching it. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.